This is Dr. Goodin with Assessment in the Classroom. We see that assessment is affected and affects a lot of other areas. We see things that's related to diversity. We need to answer what is classroom assessment. We need to classify our assessments. We need to ask what are the characteristics of effective assessment, look at traditional assessments and then alternative assessments, understand what we call the assessment cycle, and then look at grading systems. So first, what is classroom assessment? All processes involved in making decisions about students' learning progress. Okay, an integral part of teaching and learning, of course, especially when the federal government's involved or the state government's involved. We have, state mandated tests that are a big deal, and often in today's culture we have a lot of our educators teaching to the test, so to speak, which means always preparing students for the test. A lot of jobs may depend on how well students do on the test. So key terms that we're going to be looking at are evaluation, measurement, and testing. Reasons for assessment are, of course, to promote high quality learning, to increase motivation. If you're never tested, you may not, especially if you're a performance oriented student or a motivated student, you're unlikely to try as hard unless you're tested. And then accountability for both the students to test what they've learned and make sure they're learning it, and for the teachers to make sure the students are learning. The classification of classroom assessments, so we can look at them in different types. There's formal assessment, informal, formative, which means throughout the process, and then summative, which means at the very end. Teacher-made assessments, commercially made assessments. What do you think are the characteristics of effective assessments? Are they short? Are they multiple choice? Do they mix multiple choice with essay and discussion? Short answer. Well, things that we look at are validity. First of all, assessments are valid when they measure what they are intended to measure and make conclusions about their score, and the conclusions about their scores are accurate. So we have different types of validity. Content validity, is it measuring what we think it's measuring, the right content? Is it predictive validity? In other words, can it predict other valid other tests? So other tests that are on the same subject, would it predict a similar score on those tests? And then construct validity. We might have a table of specifications and alignment to make sure that everything is measuring sort of the same thing. We look at reliability, which is sort of the sister to validity. Assessments are reliable when they give consistent, stable results for each student. It's a prerequisite for test validity. So we might have test retest reliability, which is, you take the test once, you do a certain, you get a certain grade. If you were to take the test again, maybe a while later, you should have a similar score. Split half reliability just refers to basically if I gave you the odd numbers of a test, you should get about the same grade as if I gave you the even numbers of a test. An alternate form of a test can work. And then inter-observer, you can have different graders to make sure that tests are reliable and will produce the same results based on the evaluator differences. So it's really fairness. If there are threats to reliability, we have an issue. If there's a halo effect, if a test is going to be biased towards a certain student or a certain type of student, that's an issue. And then practicality is one thing we look for in reliability. Traditional assessments, we want to always have a rubric so that we know that we're grading every student the same way. Selected response assessments include multiple choice, true and false, matching items. Of course, I don't see a lot of matching at my level, but multiple choice and true and false are both quite popular. And constructed response assessments include those that you don't identify an answer, rather you provide it. Short answer, essay, completion items, and then problem-solving items. Selected response assessments do have advantages. They're efficient, they're quick to score, often with a Scantron, something like that. And they're a good measure of discrete knowledge. They assess many topics in a short amount of time. So that's awesome. Disadvantages: students can guess and get it right. Students can do that. But it also cannot measure their creative or elaborative skills. So how effective do you think traditional assessments are? Well, they have their, again, advantages and disadvantages. When it's an essay or a short answer, constructed response assessment, there are advantages. Easier to construct, measures knowledge, organization, communication skills, Bloom's taxonomy. Can they apply knowledge? Can they understand? It tests a more complex level of understanding and application. But there are disadvantages. It's time consuming to grade. Can't cover quite as much material, and they're more likely to be unreliable. Rubrics can help improve reliability, but still it's hard to predict what every student will write, especially with an essay test, unless you give them very, very specific instructions, which is difficult to do. Alternative assessments. There's no single definition of alternative assessments. The main goal is to gather evidence about how students are approaching, processing, and completing real-life tasks in a particular domain. To be authentic, an assessment should, of course, be valid and reliable, but also be in sort of a realistic environment is what we're talking about with an authentic assessment, truly testing your ability to go out there and do this process, actually measuring not what you know, but doing a task that exemplifies what you know. Alternative assessments may include these things: portfolios, performances, exhibitions, journals. And again, rubrics can improve reliability and validity. The assessment cycle we mentioned earlier involves planning, so that would be setting standards and benchmarks. And then the ideas about how you want to assess. You're going to use traditional, alternative means. You're going to match the type of assessments to the objectives. And then a combination of traditional and alternative is often an option, at least. It's not always appropriate, but it can be quite helpful to measure students in various ways. They're not just all multiple choice, all essay, to give them different types of evaluation. When do you want to assess is a good question. You can measure frequently. And this does help build that confidence we talked about when they know they're on the right track with these frequent assessments. Quizzes give students the idea, it must be on the right track. And then cumulative assessments means everything, but it requires a lot of cognitive load, a lot of remembering everything from the beginning of a semester to the end. But we do want to measure soon after instruction, sometimes as well. We may want to measure later on, and see if they actually remember it, instead of just from the instruction. Can they remember it long term? When administering assessments, we want to create a comfortable and organized environment. Keep the assessment environment as similar as possible to the learning environment. Okay, monitor students as they're being assessed, not just for cheating, but just see how they're having trouble, or be there to answer questions, among other things. Give precise directions before and during assessments. So I want to be very clear about what's expected. And then evaluating and revising. Interpreting the scores is really important in this. When there are bad scores, you have to ask yourself, did you make a bad test? Was the wording of your test ambiguous or vague? Was the instruction poor? Was there insufficient instruction? Was the test too difficult? Or it may not be any of those. But you do have to question. I think as an instructor, it's very important to keep in mind that the grades of the students are also your responsibility. If everyone's failing, then you have not taught the course. And you cannot control students who have no motivation. But assuming that you have a classroom with some level of motivation, it is your job to inspire them, to motivate them to some degree, to get at least the higher performing students and the more motivated students to acquire the material. In giving them the results of how they did on an assessment, you want to give effective feedback, sometimes student-teacher conferences, and sometimes, depending on FERPA law, which is depending on what grade you're teaching, if they're under 18, it's completely different. You can speak with the parents without any problem, but you want to communicate with the parents if possible. Of course, a lot of our lower SES students, or students that are lower performing, they often have parents that are working more and less available. In terms of grading systems, we can take the combination of assessments in the classroom, translate the results into a scale that has evaluative meaning, like A, B, C, or D, or F, report the results in a formal way. The purpose of grades is administrative. We need to tell our principal or our boss or manager how the students are doing, how the trainees are doing. It's informational for us, and it also is motivational for students to see how they're progressing, and for the teacher to see how well they're doing as teachers. So we have two types of referencing when we talk about grading. We can compare the student performance to a predetermined standard or criteria. This is a perfect paper. I want your paper to look like this. It's criterion referenced. Or we compare student performance to other students in their peer group or grade level, and that's called norm referencing. Point and percent grading. We'll start with point grading. Each assignment has a predetermined maximum value of points, and student scores on each assignment are summed and then divided by the total possible to determine an overall percentage grade. Percentages can then be converted to letter grades, and that's what most of you are probably used to. Percent grading system. Each assignment is scored and converted to a percent of correct value. All assignments are averaged for the end of course grade. The limitation with this is that with percentages, all assignments appear to have the same weight, no matter the length of the test or the difficulty. And so it's important to understand the effort and time and attention that your students put into a test, and have assignments of even appear to be the same weight, so that students know where to focus their attention and energy. Things that are not recommended by assessment experts: participation grading, attitude grading. You can't measure these very well, and they're normally unfair. It's very difficult to measure attitude, especially. Assigning 0 scores for missed assignments. Now, this gets difficult, but if possible, and some things are not, but if students are allowed to make up assignments, even for partial credit, that is a better possibility. Basing grades solely on students' improvement is not fair to many students. Basing grades on students' effort, solely on effort, that is not going to give us an accurate depiction of how much they actually know. Giving extra credit is not a recommended practice. We often do it, but students need to know that when they're being assessed, what is expected of them. If they don't come to play ball, if they don't come and put their all into that assessment, then giving them extra credit gives them sort of it gives them an excuse, a reason, to not study as hard. It tends to sort of lower student motivation, and in order to get peak performance on assessments, they need to know extra credit is not going to be available. It also just creates a lot of complexity with giving all students, an equal amount of opportunity for extra credit and grading all of it. Diversity factors. A variety of teacher practices is good for diversity. Using assessment format that fits with cultural diversity, assessment that fits with exceptionalities and preferences. So, in summary, what is classroom assessment? A classification that we looked at, characteristics of effective assessments, traditional assessments, alternative assessments, the assessment cycle, grading systems, and then touching on diversity in assessment. Now, another good practice that we've just shown here that I've modeled for you is summarizing what we just learned at the end of each lesson, helping students sort of, again, organize that information into the components. Here's what we just went over at the beginning of the next class. Here's what we went over last class. Always keep them connected to the material. Here's what you just learned. The next class, here's what you learned last class. We'll be building on that today by covering this next topic. You've seen I've been doing that at the end of each video. But then we have sections like this: connect what you learned to other chapters. What type of assessments would behaviorist views of learning encourage, and why? How would cognitive theories of learning explain the need for creating a comfortable and familiar environment for classroom assessment? What are some effective ways to assess students' problem-solving and critical thinking skills, and why? Can classroom assessments promote students' self-regulation? How? Which of the motivational theories that you learned can help explain the finding that performance assessments are more motivating than traditional paper and pencil assessments? What types of assessments are more likely to support students' need for autonomy, and why? How would you plan classroom sitting arrangements to ensure assessment reliability? I'll be speaking to you shortly about personal, social, and moral development. Thank you.